Yep. Okay, good evening everybody. Thanks so much for coming out on this cold, unseasonably cold April night to Shepherd Seminar, the first one for this year. Many of you, and welcome to people online as well, good evening. Many of you will know that Ryan and I organised the Shepherd Seminars together. This is the first time we've shared the stage, so I'll try not to hog it. This is Ryan's night tonight. I'd just like to start by doing an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge that we are meeting on beautiful Ngunnawal country tonight, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and in particularly extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be here tonight or online, and may indeed be online from another beautiful country, not Ngunnawal or Ngambri. As I said, my name's Lara Wood-Gladwin and this is Ryan Young. And Ryan and I actually met at uni through a Christian group, Navigators. I was doing arts law and Ryan was doing philosophy and in an arts degree, and has a PhD in philosophy and logic, which he's not talking about tonight. We like to find people with PhDs to come and talk at Shepherd Seminars, but Ryan's given a Shepherd Seminar on his some of his studies before. Tonight he's going to talk more about his current work as a futurist, which we just like that term. I just like that term, and his work at the ANU Futures Hub. And I think we'll see, Ryan's going to talk and give a few scenarios and some examples of what he does in his work, and then we'll take questions, and there's Slido online for people to put their questions in, and you can do that here too. If you don't want to put your hand up, you can go onto the Slido page and put that code in and put in questions, and Josiah will keep an eye on that for us. I think one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about tonight, or in preparation, is I'm a planner. I make lots of lists. I love to plan. I like to be planning next year's holiday and the holiday after that and the holiday after that. And I'm married to someone who's not a planner, shall I say? Not quite so much. And he's watching, and the girls are watching at home. And it's interesting how that then applies to your faith, to your household and your marriage, but also your faith, and how much you can plan. And sometimes the more I plan, sometimes it releases worry, sometimes it makes more worry. And then sometimes the reverse is true, I think, too. When you're not a planner, Michael seems so much more relaxed about things sometimes, but then, you get to a moment and you haven't planned and you haven't prepared for it. How do you then cope with that? So it's interesting. I'm interested to hear what Ryan says about some of those things and how God fits into that picture, and our faith and trusting our future with God, but also needing to plan and looking at what Proverbs says so much about planning and wisdom, how we balance those things. So I've got some questions around that when we get to that, but you may have lots of other interesting questions that we could go down all sorts of different tracks. So as I said, I'm not going to hog tonight. That's probably the longest thing I'm going to say the whole time. So Ryan, do you want to explain a little bit more about the ANU Futures Hub and what you do and what your work involves?
Yeah, happy to. So the ANU Futures Hub is a small team that's been running for, in various forms, 5 or 6 years now. What we do is we, work with primarily government agencies, but also other people from university and increasingly some others, to work with them to help them think long-term, big picture, and think about what that means in terms of decisions they're making. It's one of those things that I think everyone in the public service acknowledges, and secretaries tend to retire and then give speeches about the lack of strategic thinking capacity in the public service. It's acknowledged as a problem. Long-term thinking, can we think past the election cycle? So our role at the Futures Hub is to work with agencies to help them find ways of doing it that fit within the kind of work that they're doing today, the policy processes, budget cycles, elections coming up and the like. We sit at the National Security College at ANU for a couple of reasons. Partly it was Rory Medcalf, who's the head of the National Security College's idea, but also National Security College is a joint venture between the Commonwealth Government and ANU. So we're jointly staffed. We have people seconded in from different public sector agencies, academics, university people. So it's a kind of intersection place, meeting place, facilitator that sits at the gaps between public service and the university. And that allows us, a different way to think about things, different way to tackle We're connected into government thinking, but we're not beholden to the kind of existing, pressures, constraints, and all the like. So that really helps us do the job. Started off with kind of one person, and we've grown to kind of 5 or 6 now. So on the uptrend, which is good. I'm going to talk a bit about kind of how we've done that and what that involves. And we work with most departments around Canberra on various things. We've got things going from DFAT, Defence, PM&C. We've done a bit with Treasury through to Clean Energy Regulator. Smaller agencies, we might be doing something with Google later this year. So it's kind of scope, interest, things are going pretty well along that way. But it's been a slog to get here and then kind of interesting journey.
And when you're talking about planning future scenarios and working with the other agencies or organisations and moving beyond an election cycle, which is really only three and a bit years, so how far into the future are you looking? Is it a decade or is it further? Is it a generation? How far does your planning extend?
It all depends. So we kind of bring a range of approaches and methods to kind of help people think about the problems they need to think about. For some agencies, 12 months in the future is a long-term futures and they can't think that far ahead. Others, particularly defence, we're thinking 30, 40 years in the head. So it kind of depends on the range of different things we're talking about. And I guess the key thing is helping people think about it in the right way and tackle it in the right way, as opposed to, there's all sorts of challenges in kind of the ways we tend to default to thinking about the future.
So can you give us an example, but maybe a work example first, and then we can look at a church or personal example, but an example of what future planning would look like, or what a future scenario would look like, and what some of the methods are that you would use to think about that?
Yeah, I'll probably talk a bit about kind of how we think about it first, and before getting into the example. The interesting thing about doing futures, now I try to avoid the term futurist despite putting it on the advertising for this, because it conjures up images of kind of flashy kind of people that don't have much depth to it. We tend to talk about being futures analysts. So it's really kind of thinking about how we analyse and think about the future. The thing about it is, in a way, everyone is a futures analyst. We're all thinking about the future. We're all kind of making decisions in respect to what we think the future is going to be like. The challenge is, and this is particularly in work environments, we don't think about it very deeply. We just respond, react, we go with our gut feel. We go with kind of whatever's in the newspaper, on social media this morning, or whatever the most senior person in the room is talking about. The problem with that is the future's an interesting topic in that it's hard to think about it rigorously because people have really strong emotional reactions when you're thinking about the future. There's lots of hopes, lots of fears. One of the common things that happens when we get people to kind of talk about and imagine the future is it gets very dark and very pessimistic very quickly because people have so many kind of angst and fears about what happens. And so that's kind of a barrier. So if people aren't thinking in any kind of systematic way, just defaulting to what they're feeling about it, it can be panic, or sometimes it's kind of utopian, it's just going to all work out somehow. So we fall into biases, is the way we talk about it. There's common biases that we fall into thinking about the future. The most common is, for all intents and purposes, we just assume the future is going to be the same as today. Future, what's happening today will continue, and then suddenly, sometimes it turns out not to be. The classic example everyone brings up in the business community is Kodak. It was the big film, camera film manufacturer. They actually invented the digital camera, but never took on it, and they were the biggest company in that space until they crashed, because they just assumed the future was going to continue being along the same as it is today. A second bias that we often come across is that worst case scenario. You just think people can just see everything going wrong, and then you plan as though everything's going to go wrong. This probably gets back to some of the kind of planning types of people are often planning against all the things they can imagine going wrong and trying to prevent all the things going wrong. But that then can become overly rigid, and you don't actually allow a whole lot of good things to happen because you're too busy planning against the negatives. A third type is, and this is I guess, less intuitively obvious, but very common. People plan for the future they want to see happen. So this is an archetypal example is there in Silicon Valley. You have this Silicon Valley company with a techno-utopian future. Facebook's classic for this. 8-10 years ago, Facebook was going to connect the world and make the world a happier and better place. And they made engineering decisions based on if their platform worked, they assumed it was going to lead to, it was a better thing for humanity. They got that wrong. They're in pain as of it, but they had such a compelling internal vision of what the future was going to be like. They planned as though that was going to happen. That might sound funny in that case, but it happens all the time in terms of government policies or plans. We implement assuming our policy in the public service context, or it could be a church plan. We can see it, it's going to work. We act as though it is going to happen and not think about all the things that could go wrong or the complicating factors. You see it in geopolitics as well. We assume countries are going to do that because we think they should do that and we want them to do that. And that's a kind of compelling story that sucks us in and leaves us open to problems. So that's kind of what we're kind of trying to help people get through. We think about the future, but we don't do it well. The problem we have is that, people come in, you're kind of futures experts, tell us what's going to happen in the future, and then we know what we're going to be able to do about it. I mean, it's built into the way we work. Last Tuesday there was one of the nation's big exercises in kind of futures predictions got rolled out, the federal budget. We spend millions of dollars predicting the kind of economy in the government's budget the next year. We never get it right, but we make a big fanfare about the prediction and we act as though it is going to be accurate, it's going to happen. And the problem is people want that certainty. They want that prediction. They want them to tell you what's going to happen. And the problem is the future is the future. It hasn't happened yet. We don't know what is going to happen. There's all sorts of, whether you want to think about it in terms of complex systems and complexity, whether you want to think about it just the fact that very often the future is made by individual people making decisions. And if anyone can comfortably predict what's going on in Vladimir Putin's head at the moment, I'd love to know. But that's an incredibly complex, consequential decision that will shape the future, but it's incredibly hard to predict. Now, this is kind of how we explain it. The thing that I find, I guess, really comforting and really useful as a Christian is that's familiar to us as Christians. There's a strong theme all through the New Testament about we can't know the future. Jesus talked about it a lot, even to the extent where, what we think is one of the most consequential things about the future when he's coming back, he said, I don't even know. Only the Father knows that. Or kind of more in James, there's a great passage where he talks about, all those people who say, today, tomorrow, we're going to do this, carry on business. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will. So it's that, I guess, Christian principle that we try and get people across, thinking we can't know the future, we can't be confident about knowing the future. But that actually frees us up in many ways. What does that mean we do? We try and help people, I guess, think through the dynamics of what can we see that's happening that will continue, what might change, how might it change, and start getting people thinking about scenarios. What are different ways that can really plausibly the future play out? And let's think about what we're going to do, not just in one future, which could be, the disastrous one or the great one, but, what's a range of different sensible things that could happen that are quite different, ideally in tension. And let's think about what decisions we'd make in all of those different scenarios, and then what does that tell us about the decisions we need today. In a sense, it's kind of preparing for what we expect to happen, and preparing for different options rather than the kind of rigid planning towards a predetermined goal, which is often how a lot of planning in the public service and other places works. So it's that mindset, I think, is something that, again, we see coming out in a lot of the parables. There's lots of parables about Jesus talking about people being prepared. There's the one about the bridegroom coming back, and there's the kind of serving girls who are prepared and waiting, and those who kind of sit there and go, oh, we'll head off into town, have a bit of fun, and then they got caught out. It's a great example, real world, of a similar sort of dynamic. Lots of countries, kind of 5 to 10 years ago, established national medical stockpiles to prepare, which included things like PPE and masks to prepare for pandemics. A number of countries about 3 or 4 years ago decided, oh, this probably isn't that important, and started selling off their medical stockpiles, like those kind of servant girls who went, oh, I can't be bothered, this is too hard. And so it's that same dynamic playing out there, that we're asked, and I think it's really interesting the number of times Jesus talks about, there's lots of parables, whether it's about the talents or someone going away, facing an unknown future, and being about diligent and preparing, but at the same time that we can't know what's going to happen. So I guess what we try and help people do is think, we can't predict the future, we're stuck in this tension, we can't predict, but we want to know what's going to happen so we can make good decisions. How do we kind of balance that? This, for a Christian, is where kind of faith comes in terms of balancing that tension, but more broadly, how do we think sensibly, prepare for multiple different directions, and really think carefully through the dynamics of how that's going to play out. An example, I think you asked for that. Any topics you think I should try and tackle in an example? Happy to do it on the fly. Yep.
And what we do in schools really matters.
Yep.
Often we have a mismatch.
Yep.
I'm happy to give an example, but education as a topic is really important.
But just for those online, I think Libby was loud enough, but her topic suggestion was education and how we get education right to lead to the employment of the future. And also I think that opens up what is the future employment, and also what has COVID meant for schools and the way education is delivered and the way we value teachers, and that's changed, I think, in the last couple of years too. So over to you, Ryan.
So to talk through, probably most useful to talk through how we'd think about tackling a problem like that. So I guess few key factors to think about there in the kind of future of employment, education, where that goes to employment. If we start at the employment end, there's a number of different things that we know, and then we think in terms of kind of where the future of employment is going. One of the constants is humans are human beings, humans are social creatures, humans like interacting with other people, and particularly in a country like Australia, service industry is the dominant employer, and most jobs are in something where people are helping other people in some way. That's a constant. I don't think human nature is going to change. Facebook isn't that powerful. And so that's going to kind of affect, there's a kind of key parameter around where we think the future of employment is going to be. We're not all going to be stuck in our own kind of bubbles working on computers, because people just don't operate in that way. That said, future of employment, lots of things about the impact of, trends around different types of jobs appearing, jobs disappearing, what are the skills we're going to need. And we're not going to kind of answer all this, but we'd be really, getting people to think about which of those things are kind of long-standing kind of trends that will continue. And for me, one of the key things there is there's a kind of, a lot of the kind of really hands-on practical jobs are growing, aren't going away. They're hard to replace by computing, the trades and the like. And then it's the kind of lot of high-end thinking skills that people, and it's somewhat in the middle, that tends to be disappearing around the world, at least in Australia. So that says something about what the future of employment is going to be like. But there's also other, things to think about in terms of future of employment, in terms of how much it's just here, how much it's worldwide, are we going to be, transferable. So that gives us a sense, we think about and can come up with a few scenarios based on that. But then in terms of education, again, we need to think about what are the constants about kind of human behaviour, human interaction, what are kids like, what do they need, do we need to teach them, and then how are we going to kind of handle that sort of thing. So, thinking on the fly, there's a potential future where, and this is one a lot of people talk about, predominantly It's all digital, except for the kind of really hands-on practical things, which is from, you know, your building, your farming, your baristas and all that type of thing, or it's kind of high-end kind of computer skills. You know, that's a broad kind of scenario. There's another one where actually the future of work is really much more care sector focused. You know, it's people helping people and getting paid for doing that. And really the jobs in the kind of high-end technical type of stuff are going to be really limited because we don't actually need that many people doing that. There we've got kind of two different, possibly complementary, but pointing in different directions way the future of employment goes. And then we kind of need to think back, what does that mean for the education, the type of skills, the type of people, what we need to be encouraging in our kids. They're pointing in different directions, but then we ideally want to look for common elements in how we handle that and how we manage that. So that's a kind of sense of the kind of framework and approach that we'd encourage people to take. And in that, we often encourage people to go, actually, imagine some really positive futures and imagine some really negative ones and kind of think about the balance between that. It's really easy to default into either the really positive or the really negative. And education fads are one of those ones that people are always drawn to. We'll just do this and it's going to solve all the problems and our educational system will be wonderful.
We can take we've got plenty of time. We can take another topic, or we can, yep.
Thanks so much for speaking with us tonight, Ryan. I was just wondering, you gave us an example of terrible future manipulation or handling with Kodak. Can you give us an example of a company or a department that's done it really well?
Sorry, just asking for an example of a public servant department or organisation that's done some future planning really well to balance out the Kodak example where they missed the boat, really.
Trying to think, I guess, examples of one, disasters are always easy to are always more memorable than the successful ones. I think, so interestingly, I'll try and draw a few examples that are useful. I'm just trying to think of a private sector one. So interestingly, Australia was one of the countries that didn't sell its national medical stockpile ahead of COVID, unlike some European countries which did. So there was at least a sense that we'd kind of prepared and preempted and the things were there. How we managed it was a different question. Another example is a number of Australian, I think this is long enough ago now that I can talk about it, a number of Australian government agencies, mid-2016, actually started doing some contingency planning, what-if planning, if Donald Trump got elected as the US president. Everyone was saying in the media that it wasn't going to happen, it was impossible, and there was a strong kind of presumption, you know, that that's not what to do. By contrast, same year, or the previous year, in the Brexit referendum in the UK civil service, theirs mantra was, we're here to deliver government policy. Government policy was that we were going to stay in the European Union, and so they did essentially no contingency planning about what happened if Brexit got up. And you can see the consequences in some of the chaos happen. Whereas at least some of the kind of core foreign policy actually took Trump seriously as an option, and that meant that our government was able to change, you know, make the connections and things in ways that it wouldn't have been able to do and a lot of other countries struggled to do. So that's probably useful public service. So sometimes a lot of what it is just actually forcing yourself to ask, what if that thing that you don't think is likely or don't think is plausible could happen, take it seriously, and think through what it would look like for that to happen. And then sometimes when you talk through what it would look like for something to happen, it suddenly feels a whole lot more plausible and real than, you know, your initial instinct or response might be.
What about an example with in a church or your personal life, we can get to later, depending on how comfortable you are, but in a church setting with, I don't know if you've got an example that you've already thought about, or some church growth, some of the pros and cons that come with the things that need to be managed with church growth as an example, but if you've got something else.
No, happy to talk about that. I think, church growth is like any kind of future planning kind of thing. So things we encourage people to do, take for example, whether it's, church growth and you have a target for how you want to big the church, you want the church to be, or take something probably close to your work area, say the closing the gap targets that the government has for Indigenous, where we want to achieve this by this period of time. That's often the space where the kind of positive confirmation bias kicks in, and you kind of tend to think we're going to get there, how we're going to get there, and plan as though it's achievable, even likely, and that can colour our thinking. So things in that type of situation, it could be personally, your career plan is in 5 years I'm going to achieve this, or I'm going to qualify as this. Things we encourage people to do is, one is actually take some time to think about what that future would look like, whether it's when your church reaches 500 people or 1,000 people, or what would it actually look like for us to have achieved the closing the gaps targets, and talk through actually how it would function, what it's like, what it would mean for that to have situated. Often we kind of pick a goal and actually haven't thought through what it would actually be like for us to living in a world where we've achieved that goal. That sounds obvious, but often we haven't. It might be a career. I want to be, a doctor, but have I actually thought about what the life of a doctor is like and what that would mean in terms of my life, and what the kind of, and then would I actually be happy with that? Church growth, would we actually be able to function and be happy as a church of that size? And then it's about a couple of things that are useful to do. One is try and step backwards to today, going, okay, we're going to hit this target in 5 years' time. In 3 or 4 years' time means we probably need to be here. What would that look like? What do we need to, and then what do we need to do at each stage? So it's a kind of drawn out. Key thing there is trying to think through the dynamics of how the future will play out. It's easy to think today and then kind of the future is a kind of very flat view of the future. And that's one thing that we actually see in the Old Testament prophets. They can see the future, but they can't situate it in time. They don't know whether it's next week or 1,000 years' time. And often we kind of fall into that same trap. We can see a future, but when that's likely, when that's plausible. And that is one of the hardest things about prediction of the future. We can often predict what's likely to happen, but we can't predict when it's going to happen. So thinking through that, and then thinking through actually what would happen if we're going to fail, what are the things that could prevent us achieving that, and kind of just really trying to flesh out and think through the kind of different dynamics of whatever that future is like. And then a key thing that we're often trying to do is actually trying to get people to think through the futures that we're thinking about aren't just created by, in the government case, the Prime Minister or the Secretary, or in the church's case, by the Minister. It's a kind of collective whole of country, whole of church, whole of community. And the future will be driven by everyone's views and everyone's interests in that thing. It's not just going to be whoever at the top gets to say what's going to happen. And trying to understand how a range of people see the future playing out, positives, negatives, what they could do, and then is that actually possible, is a core part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I like that idea of the steps, the backward steps, I think you said, but looking at having that 5 or 10 year goal, and methodically thinking about the steps and what each different stage would look like, and what you need to put in place now to get to stage 2, and what stage 2 needs to get to stage 3, and the different things that could go wrong and the things that could be going really well, that could be both the unexpected.
And that process can often be a useful sense check about, is it actually a realistic goal? One, do we want it, or is it realistic? Sometimes you end up with, to step back, it has to be this, and then some miracle, and then we'll kind of end up getting there. I think we're all familiar with those sorts of plans, but actually stepping back and then going, actually, if it's not a realistic goal, if we're relying on some miracle, unless and this is the caveat here, is unless we're actually really acting in faith and we're confident that that's what
Yeah.
God wants us to do, then we can potentially rely on some kind of miraculous working. But outside that, if it just isn't realistic and isn't feasible, then actually we need to go back and rethink.
I also liked, I think you said when you're looking at the things that could happen and go wrong, you talked about, or you just mentioned, the sensible things that might happen, because I think moving away from those biases we have, it stops the catastrophizing and it also stops the utopia by actually thinking what sensibly can happen. And we've seen where that's not necessarily the case, like COVID I think was a catastrophe, but that's definitely, even in all of our lifetimes, an exception, that normal planning would be to think about one or two catastrophes and one or two utopias, but to have a whole lot of sensible things that are likely, and they're the ones that, it's the sensible things that you can actively plan for and look at your risk strategies and whatever, depending on sort of what your context is, and then have in the back of your mind the catastrophe and the like, what would we do if we hit 1,000 people in church in the first year instead of the 5th year? It's utopia, but it's actually a little hard to manage that huge jump. So thinking through how awesome that would be, but what are the implications of those sorts of things happening too quickly, and then hoping that it also will happen. I think that's the tension as a Christian, isn't it? Like, why wouldn't we want to have 1,000 people in a year? Why would we sit and patiently wait for 10 years so that we can put our 10 steps into place? Why wouldn't we want a miracle? But have we thought about what we would actually do? How quickly can you recruit 3 more ministers to help guide? Like, have you thought about some of the practical things? The same way we would think about it at work. How would... If a government suddenly gave me heaps of more money to run my programs, which is what we all want, I haven't got enough staff to do that. So how would I then plan for that? How would I quickly recruit? What would I be doing? And transferring some of that thinking to some of our church planning, I guess.
Yeah, a couple of points there. One is that I think one of the real risks in the kind of catastrophe mindset is we can create catastrophic situations because we're thinking of it as catastrophic, and then we react and we escalate it to that kind of level that possibly won't need to.
Yeah.
And I think classic COVID example is what's happening in China at the moment.
Yeah.
They're treating it as a catastrophe, and they're creating a much worse catastrophe as a result of planning of it as a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably elements of everyone panics. Everyone kind of reacts as though it's a kind of catastrophe, and that can actually create all sorts of unintended consequences. And I think we saw a fair bit of that with COVID. The other point is, I actually think we're often a lot better at doing this kind of sensible futures thinking approach, at least what I'm trying to say is the sensible approach, in our personal lives than we are in work lives. It's easier to think, you pick a school for your kid or deciding on a career or where you want to buy a house. We tend to think through multiple different alternatives. How could it play out? We buy a house. We don't just think, oh, it's a nice suburb now. We tend to train to think a little bit about what our future needs are and what that might be. It's often a lot harder, I find, for people to do that in the work context, just because you are tasked and your task tends to be today, here and now focused, and you're asked to deliver on that. So I think a lot of us do that instinctively, but there's ways of doing it better. I think we have a question.
Getting back to your methodologies, how far do your methodologies differ from those people who deal in risk management, business continuity and disaster recovery?
They're broadly in the kind of same ballpark of things, I would say. Where I would say our methodologies differ are encouraging people to be imaginative about actually really thinking through what the future might be like and thinking through it as a holistic thing. So one of the things we do, and picking on kind of government and the public service partly here, is that You know, there's future things that we know and we know well. You know, the ageing population in government's been something that's been talked about for 20 years. The strategy community's talked about China and the importance of China. But we don't think about all the complexities of how things are going to come together and what the combined consequences of a whole lot of these different things. So we really encourage people to be a bit more imaginative. We often bring in kind of storytelling approaches to get people to make connections and make links in ways that they wouldn't otherwise do. But the kind of overall structure and process is pretty similar to a lot of business community continuity and risk management processes. Overall structure is similar, outcomes are similar, but the way we get people to think about it is a bit different. And the other thing we try and do is we try and have something that people can get something useful in 30 minutes or 2 years, depending on how much time they've got.
Yeah, I was thinking too, back to where you started, most of the risk management planning I've done, and again, it's the public service context, is still relatively short-term risks, as opposed to really thinking about where we might be in that policy area in 10 or 20 years and the risks that come along with that. It's a slightly different approach, isn't it? Or maybe it's a significantly different approach, but really starting with an end goal that's further away than we normally think and working backwards.
And the other difference is that a lot of those processes tend to be focused on stopping bad things happen, and they're not so good at taking what are the opportunities and what are the things that we can potentially do.
ISO 31000 also considers good things beyond the yours.
Yes.
Yeah.
The standard does, but in practice, the way people actually use it is...
In terms of, are there any other questions? We'll move to the next sort of topic. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, great. Sita's got one.
And then that's
It's sort of a comment, really, because, and I think it's sort of relevant at the moment, is that just before 9/11, I was away on a conference with a high-profile economist who was really raving about how we needed a global economy. And it seems that governments were really pushing this whole global economy. Now, we've seen, just with Russia and what's happened there, how it's all kind of really unravelled. Were people really, I mean, it seems a bit crazy that people were putting so many eggs in one basket, this whole global. I just wondered if you would comment on that and whether people were really thinking in terms of the futures and the fact that you couldn't trust everyone in that global economy.
On that, I would say yes. There's a couple of things going on. One, there it tends to be. So a rule of thumb I have is someone's telling you very confidently what the future's going to be like. If we do that, they're trying to sell you something rather than they've actually kind of really thought it through. If you don't have humility about the future, then they're trying to sell you something. In that case, I think it was partly a example of what I was talking about before on this was the future we wanted to see, all these people wanted to see happen. The potential benefits were really significant, and particularly given they thought that globalizing the economy would actually encourage, different countries like the Russias and the Chinas and a whole lot of the other countries to act in a kind of more trustworthy and open way to be able to access the global economy. So it was definitely, there was a kind of theory behind it, but again, I think it was somewhat, I'd phrase this one a bit in terms of one of the real challenges I think we have in terms of understanding a lot of potential futures is we tend to assume that people think like us, and we think anyone rational is going to think like we do and make decisions in the same way we do. And, Western economists think in a particular way, and if you imagine the whole world thinks like Western economists, to pick on this example, then we would end up with a kind of globalized trade world because there aren't any downsides. But recognizing the complexity of humans, in my view, and so this is one of the things that I think, and we'll get onto this a bit more later, really helps me as a Christian in terms of do this job well, is as a Christian, I'm not rosy-eyed about what humans are like. Understand the inherent weaknesses, at least partly from myself, of human nature, kind of the things that can go wrong and the things that go wrong in history. And there's a real tendency in our kind of Western culture to get sucked into progress is good, everything's heading in a good direction, and the direction we're going in will fix a whole lot of the problems. From a Christian understanding of human nature, that's just wishful thinking, and that allows me, I think, to be a bit more clear-eyed about some of these things that people are trying to say, that, hang on a sec, have people really changed? Will people really act? Will countries really act like that? So there's a few comments on that particular.
Okay, we've got 6 questions on the Slido. So the first one is it arrogant to want to shape the future? To make, for example, something better in a secular sense?
No. To say a bit, so we, to put it in terms of, part of what God has us as Christians here is to try and advance the kingdom of God. If the kingdom of God advances in this world, that will make the people better, that will make the future better. I think it isn't arrogant to try to shape the future. It is arrogant to think that we can shape the future and we can put in place something that is definitely better. So I think there's that, we should be trying to make the world better, but we shouldn't be under any illusions that any of us, and particularly me, is going to be able to put in things in place to actually solve a whole lot of the problems. We can improve things, but understanding the complexity, understanding the way that things can kind of tail off in different directions means we need to be humble about what we can achieve, but doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
And also it just makes me think about how even our definitions of better are different. It's one thing to all want to have an aspiration, the kingdom of heaven as Christians, and an aspiration that everyone should be lifted out of poverty, which implies economic growth and more money. And then there's the other, that's really different from thinking the solution to our happiness is more materialism, more stuff, and everyone being more wealthy as opposed to everyone being out of poverty. And so where do you stop? And which is better? And who's defining better? And I know we have some time to talk about some of this, but when we're looking at how God is defining better and how we have a better quality in our life, in our character, in our values, defining how we then improve that and what the future looks like based on what the kingdom of heaven looks like, as opposed to what the financial economists tell us that is a better future. Yeah.
Okay, next question was, how might we worry less about the future? Being told not to worry is not very helpful.
But yeah, don't look at me, I worry about the future, so I don't know the answer. I pray.
So, I mean, being told not to worry isn't helpful. I think that said, Jesus is very explicit about, don't worry, in Matthew's Gospel, don't worry about the future. What is it? Not even a bird falls to the ground that I don't know, and I care much more about you. So I think there's that element of God's, God doesn't just say not worry, but he says, actually, I've got it in hand, I'm looking after you, and you don't need to worry because, to pick another, I'm working all things out for your good. One thing that I find interesting in that is if you look at the Luke passage where Luke talks about that same thing rather than the Matthew one, where Jesus said, don't worry about your life. Immediately following that is there's a parable where he talks about, be dressed, ready for service, keep your lamps burning like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. So Luke's gospel connects don't worry about the future, God's got it in command, but that doesn't mean sit back, relax, you don't need to worry about it. It's kind of be diligent, be doing the right things, be prepared for different things. So I think there's an element in terms of not worrying about the future, that it's not, it'll all be fine, she'll be right. que sera, but there's an element of actually there are things you can do, there's things you can be thinking about, but I guess for me the other aspect to it is no matter how much you worry, no matter what you do, you can't change the future, you can't control the future, you can't determine exactly what's going to happen. So it's that, worrying's not going to fix the future, you can't do it, let go, it's in God's hands, and that can, help shape. It's not an easy answer, but I really find, again, in terms of my work, it helps that if I'm confident the future is in God's hands, and I am, that takes a whole lot of the kind of anxiety, the excitement, the emotion out of thinking about my job and the different things, and allows me to think, I think anyway, kind of more realistically and more insightfully, because I aren't caught up in a whole lot of the emotion and the challenge and the different things. It kind of allows me to be a little bit more detached and kind of understand really some of the dynamics in ways that other people who are trying to do this don't. And it's one of the risks I see, that people who try and do this, a lot of this work, often end up really focused on a particular issue that they're really concerned about, because they struggle to kind of detach themselves from it.
Yeah, and it's one of the great blessings of being a Christian, isn't it? That knowledge that God is in control and that people are not. And so when we talk about these things as if politicians, and after we've done your course at the ANU, we've done all our planning, that everything's going to go according smoothly and we're going to have benevolent bosses. And, that whether that happens or not is what you're saying really is over there, because ultimately God is in control. Yep. And ultimately we have this faith in something much bigger than our planning and much bigger than our worry. So
yeah, absolutely.
We sit in that space, that quiet space, and a patient space.
Patient space. And the other great thing about the future not being kind of locked in stone, easy to predict, uncontrollable, is it can mean a whole lot of good things can happen that we're not expecting as well. It's easy to think of all the bad things that can happen, but there's equally a whole lot of good things and positive things can potentially happen that we can't kind of predict and control. And so, maybe one of those mental things is, when you're thinking of all the worst case scenarios you can think about, start thinking about, what are some of the good things that could go well as well, or how could God bless me, rather than, what are all the challenges He's going to throw my way.
Next question. How do you think about situations where there are clever opponents to our future goals and plans, whether it's the other country, the other company, Satan, etc.?
So, a few things we do there. One is actually, so assuming we have some goals or plans of what we want to achieve, what does our clever opponent want to achieve? What does their ideal future look like? What does their kind of negative future look like? And what are they trying to do to achieve that? Rather than, we tend to focus and this tends to happen organisationally. You work in a team, you work in an organisation, everyone talks to each other and we understand how we think and we forget there's people outside. Actually take some time to think, and we often run exercises that we call red teaming or the like, where we get people to actually think as though they are coming from the different perspective. What would the clever adversary, or it's often valuable not just to do it for an opponent, a partner or someone you might work with or someone who's kind of got some other stake in the thing you're thinking about. What would they be thinking? What are they trying to achieve? What are their goals? How they might go about it? And kind of marry those two things up. I've got to do some fun things. I've once got to ask just about the entire senior executive of the Australian Federal Police to come up with a strategic plan for a global criminal syndicate as a way of getting them to do exactly that. Think about kind of what the clever adversary opponent would do. And a few of them, I'm really glad they're cops, not on the other side.
They're very good at it. And it's I think we've talked about this a lot and some of the topics last year too, just engaging our minds as well as our hearts when we talk about our faith and when we look at God, and not being sly or manipulative, but being clever back, like engaging and working with the wisdom that we have, without being sly.
And if you can think like your clever opponent, you've probably got an advantage in terms of trying to achieve what you want to achieve.
So next question. Most of the discussion has been about centralised decision making or makers. What about decentralised decision making?
So, for a start, I think the kind of principles I've been talking about, I think they're more kind of principles rather than a kind of strict method to follow. Work just as well. I mean, you can apply them if you're trying to decide where you want to go out for dinner tonight, or you can apply them if you're coming up with a defence capability plan where you're spending billions of dollars. So I don't think they're dependent on the kind of centralised nature. It's really thinking about, if you're going out for dinner tonight, how hungry are you? What are the common things? Imagine yourself going out to a few different places and which one feels better. And then you might need to go, I want to go there, but work backwards and go, actually don't have enough time. Maybe I'll try something else. So it's the same principles. So I don't think the approaches depend on the particular decision making. I think where you've got lots of people kind of making different decisions, you more want to get into that space where you're trying to be a bit more imaginative, even more thinking about, and trying to understand how the collective of decentralised decision making is going to lead up. It's trying to then really kind of think about the different factors that are going to influence their decisions. If you're trying to analyse it and understand it, how that's going to play out, what the different dynamics there will be. And often the most useful way to do it is put yourself in their shoes in some way, at least if you can't talk to them. I've been trying for about 4 or 5 years to get a public service agency to invite a tradie along to kind of one of our workshops and roundtables to actually get that perspective of a whole group of people that really are often left out of kind of government decision making and thinking, because that's majority of Australians would be more accurately reflected in the way they think by tradies or cleaners or nurses than are by Canberra public servants. I haven't succeeded yet.
And so is saying the same sort of principles work? So if it's sort of decision by committee, or looking at a church example rather than a minister, it's the same principles, it just adds complexity.
Yep.
Same with going out to dinner with someone else adds complexity, and a group of friends adds complexity, but it can still be done, and you can still keep everyone or most people happy. It just takes longer. It takes longer,
and it can be a useful way of getting there. So in terms of taking people out for dinner, actually having that discussion, if it's a committee decision, around actually what do we think the relevant future will be like? What do we want it to be like? What don't we want it to look like? How do we see that playing out? You often end up with different people working together, have really different views about what we're trying to achieve, or what they imagine a good future is going to be like, or what the kind of core dynamics that will shape the future is like. And sometimes it can be a really valuable way of, I've found in my work, helping people have a genuine kind of involved discussion about the issues without talking about the decision you have to make today, without talking about any of the decisions where in the public service context there might be budgets on the line or empires on the line, or you've got to answer to a minister, or in a church context it's the kind of established ways. If we can taking it into kind of talking in a sensible, structured way about the future can take away some of that, I guess, heat and the kind of constraints we're working with, and actually kind of open up to thinking about more things that are possible. It's funny in my job sometimes that you have a group of people that regularly meet in IDCs, interdepartmental committees, for those who aren't in the public service, and they're generally, tense, horse trading type organisations, meetings, get the same people to talk about the future. You often have a really open, engaged, fruitful discussion that's much more kind of genuine sharing of ideas and kind of intellectual thinking, because you've taken it outside of something hangs on the decision today, and can be really productive.
Yeah, I mean, I work at the National Indigenous Australians Agency, and it's really encouraging to see that a genuine push in our, or move in our work to co-design, which is the buzzword, but it just means designing programs with Indigenous people, and moving towards them taking the lead in that process, not just coming to a meeting, but eventually handing money over and they run programs the way they see fit, not running. There's a difference between that and between them running a program that I've still designed and give them the money, but let them run it in a way that's going to work best in an Indigenous community. And then I think about a church context where you see often in history you have a really charismatic leader who'll have a vision, and it's really hard to take people along with that without doing some of that planning you talked about right at the beginning. What are the steps in a church to get there, and how can you have consensus and bring people along with any vision in a company as well, bring your shareholders along, but to have those meetings and discussions and all-day workshops that take so long but are more fruitful in the end because everyone's on board and is working towards that vision together and has shaped it a bit. So the original vision may actually end up being quite different because you've taken everyone's views into account and have a future that everyone's defined rather than the future that the leader has defined.
Yep. Or at least everyone has some part of. Companies often have it a lot easier than governments for that reason, because a CEO has a lot more authority than the Prime Minister or a Secretary. So, or it depends on the church whether they have more authority than a minister.
Are there any more?
I've got 3 more that have come through.
Are there any more on the floor? Shall we just check? Yeah, at the back. It's Josh.
Thanks, Ryan. Really interesting discussion so far. I was wondering, in the example that you gave of Kodak, there's kind of like creative destruction sort of popping up out of nowhere, making an industry obsolete. And often you kind of come across these non-linear jumps in I guess, prediction and in just how trends play out over time. I guess another example is like fat tails, and if there's like kurtosis in the distribution of possible futures. I was just wondering, in the example that you gave in education and also in terms of like backward solving, they both kind of seem to assume somewhat somewhat of a linearity in the process. I was wondering if you could give an example of like how in the process you incorporate the non-linearity as well.
Yep, happy to. So on that, just trying to think of the simplest way. So couple of things. The examples I gave, I guess, were designed to, encompass the kind of core kind of expectations. In terms of non-linearity, a few ways you can go about it. One thing we often do is actually explicitly keeping about the human kind of mindset that goes to kind of catastrophes or kind of utopias type of thing, is that's non-linear thinking. It's actually ingrained in the way humans think. We just tend not to do it analytically, we tend to do it creatively. So opening up and allowing and encouraging people to be creative, we often ask people to come up with actually, what are the potential, whether it's shocks or disruptions or things, that how could it be really different? Tell us how it could be really different and what could be really consequential and how it's different. So actually explicitly asking people to take some time to think about those potential disruptions that are non-linear. And the challenge in that is you can spend all your time talking about all the kind of crazy things that could happen, which isn't a useful use of your time. But even then, one thing that can be useful is, your non-linear kind of outcome. Actually do the step back process. We call it backcasting, if anyone's interested in looking it up online. And sometimes that thing that looked kind of crazy or wacky, if you kind of take the steps back to it, actually is quite likely. You can see a kind of plausible, really kind of potentially likely way that could end up happening. And I would argue lots of people, in terms of the Kodak example, saw the kind of digital revolution coming and expected it to happen. It was just Kodak itself that didn't see it. So opening your kind of, again, this depends on whether your kind of scope and the time you've got, but taking a little bit of time to think about actually how could something really unexpected happen? What could be those things? And instinctively as humans, it can be useful. You tell a story about what's going to happen, and if you're trying to tell a story, there will be some kind of big crisis or catastrophe or something in the middle of the story, and that's probably a way of uncovering some of the potential non-linearities. That said, non-linearities are hard to predict, so often what we encourage people to do is, rather than try and identify what they necessarily are, being open to that they could happen, and then it's a lot of it's that contextual, paying attention to what's happening, and where you can see something starting to shift. But that's a broader topic.
I just wanted to ask about I guess more about the progressive mindset. So I saw like a sketch of like medieval mindset is like, you know, this much on my life and then this like really long period of time afterwards, which is like the afterlife or something. And then our mindset is like, you know, really long stretch now and then like question mark afterlife thing. And I think like, you know, the progressive mindset has a view of like perfectibility. There's always another march to march or, you know, cause to whatever. Whereas Christianity has progress in it, but it's like a heavenly progress in the eschaton at the end of time. And I think, like, my view is like Christianity sort of invented the idea of progress, like Augustine say in with the city of God, like versus the city of man. But I'm quite interested in that, so interested in any comments that you have.
Big topic. I think so. A few things to So a few things to say there. One is and this goes, I guess, in the biggest picture, the kind of the view of the future, you know, where we think things are going to end up, you know, and your point there being, you know, for Christians, it's, you know, Jesus returning on this world and kind of eternal life. That shapes, whether it's that or whether it's death at that kind of biggest picture, or what you think is going to happen next year, shapes how you're going to act today. You kind of act in light of what you think, you know, the end of the story, if you want to go, it's being like. You know, if you think next year, to pick a topical example, if you think next year interest rates are going up, or if you think interest rates are staying low, that's going to shape what you think is going to happen, and even more so, the kind of end of history eschaton element. So I think that's really significant. I think there's a couple of things. The particular progressive mindset I was talking about before isn't just that we do things and then it's kind of question mark. There's that sense which really has come through Hegel and Marx, if you want to go into the philosophy, that actually the world is progressing to something better inherently kind of by the outworking of the force of history. And so therefore, progress is good. You know, progress will lead to a better place. Our world is trending to kind of somewhere better, and therefore, to pick a term that comes up these days, you want to be on the right side of history because the future is better than the past. That's a particular, and I think at odds with Christian view of the world. It doesn't take into account the kind of fallenness of humans. It doesn't take into account the kind of brokenness of who we are, and the fact that the kingdom of God isn't yet. Jesus' reign isn't manifest in the world, and there are kind of other powers and other things that have a lot of control. And to be frank, I also think it is, I guess, it's a dangerous mindset in the sense that it tends to mean that people fall in the trap of whatever the latest thing is, because it's new, it must be better than what was in the past. And newness being good can really lead people into kind of all sorts of weird directions. There's a few thoughts.
It's still another tension in Christianity, isn't it? Because we know that we're fallen, But we pray in the Lord's Prayer all the time that we want the kingdom of God to come on earth
Yep.
as it is in heaven. We want things to be better.
Yep.
We do want to keep striving, and I hope that my future on earth is better in that sense of more godly.
Yep.
Not just waiting till I die, and that propelling myself to continue to work on my sins or be more patient, have more fruit of the Spirit, to have better relationships and a better future now, a better now, not just waiting, in keeping with the tension that it's still fallen and I'm still going to sin.
Yep.
And sometimes I might sin even more. And then, so it's still that tension, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still a tension. I mean, I think life is full of tension, and that's where kind of a lot of the productive things happen, sitting in the middle of that tension. But also I think, for me, the key difference there is, probably the key difference is that as Christians we believe there's a kind of transcendental standard, a transcendental truth and transcendental standard of goodness.
Yeah.
And therefore a better life is something that more closely matches God, the good, and things can go badly if they head in that direction. Whereas if you don't have that kind of transcendental or any kind of sense of value beyond kind of what is currently happening, then you can easily kind of, how do you judge whether we're going in a better or worse direction?
Yeah.
I think we've got...
I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about how we integrate our thinking about the future with the image we have in the book of Daniel, of the kingdoms, from gold down to clay, and also how we integrate what Jesus said about reading the signs of the times and the end times. So how as Christians should we think of all of that and the future?
Great question, and something that I had prepared, thought about. So in terms of the signs of the times, I think that's about, to me, the signs of the time always is connected to the kind of parables about, watch, pay attention, be prepared, and look around you. So in terms of to take it out of the signs of the times, I think that way of thinking about it's really useful, not just for the end times, but actually for, if we're doing, whether it's geopolitical analysis or thinking about social structures or thinking about what's happening, maybe at the local school, is that going in a good direction? When things are changing, things are going to happen, there are always signs and things that are kind of out there that we need to be paying attention to, and then we should be open, thinking about, watching out, thinking about what's happening, what's changing, what might change. I find it really helpful to be thinking about these signs, or we often in work talk about them as signals. It helps to have that kind of imaginative sense of the future could play out in a few different ways. If it's going to play out in this way, we expect to see these things. If it's going to play out in this way, expect to see these things. That intuitive sense that actually we're seeing these things, that means that this is more likely. And there are cases, particularly around the fall of Jerusalem, that Jesus is very clear about, when you see these things happen, in that case, get out of Jerusalem because things are going to be going very badly. And a lot of those things are possibly, if you think about it from a intelligence analysis perspective, possibly not that surprising. So I think that goes into the future's in God's hands. We can trust him, but that doesn't mean we kind of can absolve ourselves of responsibility and think back. We should be paying attention, thinking about, actively engaged in that, doing what we can to, shape the future in a good way, but recognizing that actually we don't have control. God has control, and we need to trust him in that. I'm not sure if that kind of helps, but that's how I think about it.
Hey, I wanted to ask you a nerdy question, similar to the gentleman's comments about St. Augustine, that when we try to force progress on something, and in the Australian story I think of, the Indigenous portfolios, when we push through what became the stolen generations, that came out of a progressive agenda. That was to help people.
Yeah.
Through to the Pick Bats program of only a few years ago, but both, you know, we've got a concern, there's this real problem, let's push it through, and things just go disastrously bad. But there are lots of things that have got better in Australian life. So what's the mark of those things, that we are wealthier and we are living longer than we did 60 years ago? What do you think the difference is between those two things?
I guess there's a few different factors. So one is, how do I say it? So one is the sense that, to tie it back to the stuff I was talking about beforehand, Pinkbacks, you know, recent is a classic example of, we had this vision, we're going to do this, it's going to be great, it's going to achieve all these wonderful things. And there wasn't, and the kind of subsequent inquiries and Royal Commission, you know, people weren't able to voice the kind of objections or what about this or what about this can go wrong. We got sucked into this vision of a future that we thought was going to be great, at least the people involved, and that kind of, and I'd say that emotional vision as well as the kind of politics overrode the whole of the kind of critical thinking in that case. It's probably, you know, it may be similar in the stolen generation. So in terms of, I guess in terms of how we avoid some of those things, it's that being able to kind of have that critical thinking, critical debate, weigh up the kind of pros and cons, and actually, how could this go wrong? How could this go right? What are the kind of ways, pathways it could go? In terms of, I guess, key distinction between things, you know, that went disastrously wrong and things that have gone okay and things that have improved, I think sometimes some of them is just luck. Sometimes, you know, we try something and it works, and we try something else and it doesn't work. Sometimes it is, I would say, if you go back to the kind of design of the kind of legislation or policies, how accurately do they match the realities of what humans are like and what the world is like, and take into account the brokenness and the ways humans operate. By way of, you know, example, one of the things that comes up in a lot of things we do is, you know, we need federal government to work together closely without kind of bureaucratic silos and kind of everyone kind of function together. My comment to that is that it's hard enough to do that in one family where you all live in the same house, to have everyone actually be across everything that's happening. How do we expect the whole federal government can do it? So really thinking about that design in terms of kind of what works with people and what doesn't. And I do think there is an element that this is a bit outside the kind of future space, but the more we think we can closely control the outcomes and are confident that we're going to control the outcomes, to put it in Christian terms, the more we're saying we're in charge and we're not leaving it to God, the more likely we are to end up in some kind of disaster.
And I was thinking the second point you made tied to the first point you made, that the more you run sort of doggedly towards something without listening to the other voices, or without just assuming all the silos should work together, actually the silos are useful, and the tension and the arguments, and having someone who wasn't in the room coming into the room later and saying, did you think of this, can be really useful, and that the better planning, policy or church planning or your own life planning, if it's my own career, to test it with some other people who are quite different from me and say, do you think this is going to work? And they say no. That, like you said, you shouldn't be a doctor, that's not going to suit you at all. Like you might, you know, to test those ideas and to push it until it is, it's real progress, until it's actually improved, to have that healthy tension and debate and...
Yeah, and I think there is a tendency that we want to have our plan, whether it's our 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, and then we stick to the plan. But, you know, plan hits reality, and reality always wins. But if we stick to our plan, nevertheless, then we end up in all sorts of challenges and awkward places.
Ryan and I talked a bit about Proverbs 16:9. The heart of a person plans their way, but the Lord establishes his steps, or her steps, which I think sort of sums up a bit of what you've been talking about tonight, that need to plan and be prudent and think about options, but to still hold that other hand all the time, saying that God is still in control and God is still directing us. We're close to running out of time, and I know there were a few more online, but I thought one question we might finish with, and then we can pray, is just interested in your views on how you think the things we've talked about tonight and thinking about our future, how that should change the way we pray and what we should be praying for. Everything we're praying for is something in the future. We want something to change, we want something to be better next week or in 10 years' time. Should we pray in the specific? Should we pray generally, your will be done, Lord? Like, what's your view on how this planning affects our prayers? And then we might kind of pray, and maybe Ryan can have a look at the stuff online and write back in the chat tomorrow or something.
Yeah, cool.
On Facebook.
So the first thing I want to say is that if we're confident that the future's in God's hands and he's in charge, that should free us up hugely, you know. It gives us the freedom and the confidence to take risks, try things. You know, if we fail, God's kind of looking after us. We need to be kind of sensible and kind of prudent, but that doesn't mean cautious.
Yeah.
I think, you know, sometimes it should give us that kind of confidence and freedom to be kind of bold and take risks, as opposed to, because, you know, in the end, God's in control. It doesn't mean, you know, I think some of the examples where we're kind of being overly aggressive. So I think in terms of how it shapes how we think about the future, how we pray, I guess a few thoughts come to mind. One is that I think we tend to pray about the steps as opposed to praying about the kind of end point or the outcome, what we want to see achieved at times, and kind of really kind of praying, and I think praying through where we want to see, you know, whether it's a friend or a relationship or, you know, kind of praying through kind of what the outcome and what that looks like and how that works out. You know, it's that analogue of, I talked about, you think about the future and actually talk through what the future's like, pray through that as well. I think that helps. I think too, in terms of, I mean, I think of prayer, it's a conversation rather than we're not asking for a list of demands. So it's about, you know, we should involve God as part of that kind of conversation and people we're talking to in terms of working through kind of the futures and what's going to work and what's not going to work and what is to be prudent. And I think it should, I mean, personally, I do use prayer as a way of testing some of this kind of thing. You pray through this, should I do this? God, you know, be open to God's will. But I don't think it means we shouldn't be specific. It just means that we should be open to God saying no rather than, or it not happening, and that not being kind of working through and understanding that. I guess the final point is, key thing we try and get to do for people to do when thinking about the future is be a bit more imaginative, be a bit more creative, kind of don't be kind of so safe. And we should be doing the same thing when we pray.
Yeah, it really challenged me to think about asking God what his end point is for me. So then maybe some of the steps might be in my control, but what would he like? What, in whatever the topic is, what's his future for me, my end point, or for my family or my career or whatever, and how can I listen to that and listen to the Holy Spirit more in shaping the end point in that conversation with God, and thinking that through.
Yeah, and often God's end point for us isn't what we wanted or expected. And to be honest, this work I'm doing at the moment isn't ever something I planned to end up in, or it wasn't kind of an aspiration of mine. It's just something that kind of happened, right place, right time. And for me, I get the thing about that is I get to work with a range of people from graduates to secretaries in a whole lot of different departments, helping them, I hope, make better decisions for, their work, the future of the nation. Small, little bits, from now, that's how I see kind of what we're trying to do, help them make better decisions. And so that, I never thought I would have ended up here. It wasn't what I planned to do, but I feel like it's in a place that I can actually serve, make a difference, and hopefully try and shape a better future, to pick up on a question from before.
And I think something we haven't talked about maybe enough tonight, we've run out of time, is that it's worth saying though, there are times when it really is that creativity is a massive leap of faith, and you can't plan and you should do it.
Yep.
And I think of, it's easy in our safe careers here, but think of the way missionaries still live now, and the way people have had to change their whole expectations with COVID and loss of jobs, and there are massive leaps of faith. And we haven't really touched on that because the topic was future planning, but it's worth, sometimes that is the plan, is to take a leap and let God completely be in control of that situation or that decade, or, that whatever it is. We shouldn't lose sight of that other side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't all be planned. I found this lovely prayer this week. One of the Common Grace has got a Lenten series, an email that comes around every week. It's lovely to read, and you can subscribe to it, and they do it at Advent as well. And I think Tear Fund has one happening as well, but I just thought this might be a really appropriate prayer to finish with. And thanks so much to Ryan for his time and his preparation and his planning for tonight. And
to be honest, this didn't take much planning. I talk to people about this stuff all the time. So.
And thank you all for coming, and thanks to those online, and sorry we didn't get round to all the questions. Anyway, let's just pray. Redeeming Creator, make us like the dreamers, awaken our imaginations to see hope for the future. Your kingdom breaking in with justice, compassion and truth. Renewing Spirit, flood us with streams in the desert. Evoke our emotions to feel the pain of our sisters and brothers crying out in lament for release, for freedom and welcome. Restoring King, send us out to bring change, enliven our hands and feet to sow the seeds of justice, walking together in new paths of righteousness, blessing and rejoicing. In Jesus' name, Amen. Thank you. And I'm sure Ryan is happy to stay around and have a chat if you've got burning questions. Oh, sorry, last thing, next Shepherd Seminar. 16th of May, next term, Emma Tuerno from the morning service. She's a psychiatrist, and she's going to talk about being a Christian and dealing with mental health issues. We haven't narrowed the topic. We'll try and have it a bit more narrow than that. That's quite broad, but we'll give you some more information. But it's Monday the 16th of May. So see you there.